it might record, might feedback, but it might not. So
I know a woman who could hear a song, never took a music lesson in her life, sit down at the piano and play it.
my father could do that. Yeah. Anyway, all right. So we're switching over from Eastern Europe, and what we talked about was early modern into the modern area and becoming modern. Becoming modern in Eastern Europe is not the same as becoming modern in Central or Western Europe. Because modern in Eastern Europe never gets that modern until the interwar years maybe. And now it's perfectly modern, but it's not there anymore. So, so what do we mean by modern when we're talking about the areas that will become Germany by the end of the 19th century? Germany unites in 1871, and beginning in 67 to 71, and Italy also unifies in the same era, but we're not talking about Italy anymore. We talked about the period when Italy was interesting, which is the Renaissance period, and that's really special period for Italy. Otherwise, Italian Jews are nice, but not super central. Whereas German Jews are central for the modern Jewish experience. And that they're sort of the guidelines that we take for at least American Jewish history, but also British, French, what have you, that they are in the vanguard of becoming modern. Okay, what is modern? What characterizes the difference between a modern Jew and an early modern or medieval Jew?
Well, certainly the place of women.
Well, that starts to
and
change.
Services, and maybe the structure of the services. I'm thinking of the reform movement in Germany.
We're talking about the reform movement, and that is a major change, or introduces major changes, although the reform movement does not really change the legal status of women. It gets rid of things, but it doesn't change anything. In other words, it doesn't adapt halakhic practices into a more modern form. It just says, we don't do that anymore. So part of modernity, at least in Western Europe, is sort of rejecting the traditional Jewish past in many ways, but not always. And one of the things that makes women important here is that women preserve Jewish tradition in Central Europe. Women, because of their practices in the home and because they're not super involved, I mean, they do go to synagogues in the 19th century, and now they help to change, they're the only people who were there in the Reform synagogues in Europe and eventually in the United States as well. But women become the bearers of modern culture, modern Jewish culture, not modern culture, and they integrate Germanness and Jewishness. I mean, what's really important in modernizing in Germany, or what becomes Germany, is the concept of Bildung. Are you familiar with Bildung?
Yeah.
Bildung means structure, what have you. It's sort of a kind of gentility, educated gentility. You are becoming more, I don't know, educated, sensitive, aware, uplifted. It is central to the bourgeoisification. Is there such a word? And then to Germany becoming middle class, the rise of the middle class in Germany and the upper classes. And this was one of the best books in Jewish women's history by someone named Marion Kaplan. You might have read some of her stuff before, mainly, well, this is 19th century, but she also writes on 20th century. But she is, this is really top notch. It's a little bit dense, but it is really good. Anyhow, so she calls this the making of the Jewish middle class. And that is the modernization of German Jews, becoming middle class and upper middle class.
Does it have to do with them becoming more German?
No, it starts in Germany. It doesn't have to be in Germany. The same thing's going to happen here, but with German Jews, even though they don't come here as reform, but it is a modernization process that's really not associated with Eastern European culture.
But does it have to do with assimilation?
It has to do with acculturation into the middle class.
So-
It's not so much, assimilation means disappearing,
Yeah.
okay? And most Jews do not disappear, even though some will try to, but they acculturate. They become more and more like their neighbors.
So it's like the German Enlightenment bleeds into the Jewish experience.
That's right. It is the impact of the German Enlightenment on Jews, the result of the Jewish Enlightenment, which comes out of the German Enlightenment, and modernization of becoming much more like your comfortably situated neighbors. Okay. So it means that Jews are speaking the language of the land, so that by the 19th century, German Jews are speaking German. Okay, not Yiddish. They were in the 18th century, but 19th century, educated German Jews, and most, if not all, German Jews by the 19th century are becoming more educated. All boys were, and girls are starting to at least go to elementary school and also to higher girls' schools. But so they are becoming they're more advanced than their neighbors in terms of education. Although some of them in small towns, and even in some of the larger cities, they go to Jewish schools. There were Jewish primary schools in many, many towns and villages in Germany, even up until the early 20th century. But they weren't necessarily wonderful schools, but they did teach Jewish subjects and secular subjects, both. Unlike the Cheder in Eastern Europe, or the schools set up by the Beth Jacob movement for Eastern European Jewish girls, they didn't really teach modern stuff. They basically taught Jewish stuff with some modern subjects thrown in, secular studies thrown in. In Germany, the education is primarily, if not exclusively, secular. And instead of, admiring a yeshiva bacher who spends all of his life studying Talmud, when you get into the 19th century in Germany, you don't have yeshivas anymore. You might have had them in the 18th century, certainly in the 17th century, but that's the kind of education that Jewish boys would get. By the 20th century, by the 19th century, you've got Jewish men starting to go to universities. Even rabbis need university degrees in Germany before they're ordained. That's different than in Eastern Europe. Okay, so and women start to become more educated too, and following in the paths of their fathers and their brothers, essentially. And by the 20th century, which we'll be talking about later on, if we're still talking about it, but in the period that I was working with, the women that I studied, who attended universities in Germany and Austria, were born in the late 19th century and into the 20th. They lived into the mid 20th century. And you can see the process of, they talked about their grandmothers and how their grandmothers observed everything and how they remember it from their childhood. They remember Shabbos dinners. They remember, they memoir after memoir after memoir, written by men or women, talk about their grandmothers, not their grandfathers, their grandmothers. And, Friday night dinners and a holiday, seders, and, that's what they remember about being Jewish. They're also getting a Jewish education somewhat. They have confirmation classes, but they don't have intensive Jewish education anymore. They've got intensive secular education, but retaining Jewishness. And the traditions that are still maintained are the traditions in the home, for which the women are responsible. Now, this doesn't happen overnight, and it's not the first thing that happens, because originally in becoming modern, Jewish women in Central Europe and Germany, they wanted to get out of the rigidities of Jewish life. Not so much their marriages, but they wanted to become part of culture, the outward German culture. And you have, this late 18th century, right? The circle around Moses Mendelson, are you familiar with Moses Mendelson? He was sometimes considered to be the first modern Jew, although he had predecessors who probably were modern before him. But he was a German philosopher who was essentially an Orthodox Jew. He observed Jewish law, but he was also into modern philosophy, and he was respected as a philosopher. And even some people thought that he was superior to some of the German philosophers of his day, give or take. But, and then I could go on to tell you the story of his family. He had 6 children. He and his wife, spoke Yiddish to each other, but he was self-taught in classical literature, Latin, German, what have you, and he wrote on Jewish subjects as well as on philosophy. But he had 6 children, 3 sons and 3 daughters. Interesting to see what happened to those kids, especially after he died. His sons, both of them, the older one, I don't know how, we have 5 kids. Anyway, the 2 older sons both convert to Protestantism. That's how you get Felix Mendelson Bartholdy. Okay. His father converted as a young man, his mother converted, and when the kids were born, they were baptized at birth. So Felix Mendelson grew up as a Protestant, so did his sister Fanny, and and they were both brilliant music composers, and they were both brilliant. They were equally brilliant, except of course because Felix was male, he got to be well known. It's only these days you can turn on the radio and listen to Fanny Mendelssohn. It's not that she didn't write the stuff, it's just that it was, some of it wasn't even preserved or performed. So now we're getting all this women's music that's being spread around, but it was always there, and it was always very nice, but nobody ever played it because it was written by a woman. So that's one aspect. That's an exceptional family, clearly. But okay, so the 2 sons convert to Protestantism, and they're not really good Protestants. They just wanted to be more accepted into Christian society, and there was a wave of conversions, especially in Berlin, but also elsewhere, among the wealthy Jews. It used to be that Jews converted to Christianity were not upper class. Especially in the 18th century, a lot of the converts were young Jewish women who they're often domestic servants, and they convert because they want to marry somebody who isn't Jewish. Their prospects aren't very good anyhow, so they convert. And there are always some conversions, and especially women's conversions, you see, of these women who just want to. In Germany, in order to intermarry, in order to marry a Christian, you have to convert. Okay. Now later on, you can just become without religion, and that's conversion. And many Jews did become confessionslos, without religion, and those people could marry Christians if they wanted to, or they could marry other confessionslos, so they could marry Jews. I mean, they're without religion, but anybody who belonged to a religious community had to marry somebody within the religious community. It's sort of like Israel. They don't really recognize civil marriage, they only recognize religious marriages. Okay? So that meant that you had to convert. And so by the end of the 18th century, you have this, I think we talked a little bit about court Jews and the wives of court Jews. I think we talked about Gluckel of Hameln, whose husband was a jeweler and a wealthy middleman who was a court Jew, and therefore she was in that highly elite group of Jews, even though she wrote in Yiddish, she spoke Yiddish, her husband did too. So they're not modern, but they are part of the court Jew class. Well, by the 18th century, that's after her death, the end of the 18th century, you have a whole group of these court Jews, these men, and some of them, become secularly educated, become philosophers, become, now they also become professionals. So these are wealthy men, some of them were bankers, most of them were bankers actually, but some of them are doctors, lawyers not so much, but they have succeeded in business or in medicine or in something like that. And they have a rather good lifestyle and they live rather well. And therefore, their wives get accustomed to mansions in Berlin, okay? And in that late 18th century society, you have the beginning of what are known as salons. Familiar with salon culture? Okay. Well, in especially prominent, it was going on in France too, but there weren't as many Jews in France, and they weren't so much a part of the salon culture of the 18th century, maybe the 19th century, but not 18th, not even 19th actually. But in Germany, you had this group of, it's only about a couple of dozen women, 2 dozen at most, who become salon women. They have their own salons, which is, they have an open house in their living rooms, in their mansions. Just about all of them are wealthy. And it becomes a place where intellectuals, Christian intellectuals, can come and openly talk. Now, before that, Christians didn't generally come into Jewish homes. And Christian women still don't come into Jewish homes. But these intellectual men, many of whom were involved with the Romantic movement, Jewish men were involved in the Enlightenment, and they're into philosophy. Well, the Jewish women are not into philosophy, they're into romanticism and literature and general culture, okay? These girls who know foreign languages, they could read them, girls don't have much of a Jewish education. As a matter of fact, they don't have any Jewish education. I mean, even Moses Mendelson, whose sons got a nominal Jewish education, I suspect that they were bar mitzvah and what have you, sisters, not at all. They don't know anything about being Jewish. Right? Which becomes a pattern, especially for the wealthy. You don't bother teaching your daughters that. They learn foreign languages and they learn dancing and they learn music and they learn, all the how to be cultivated and cultured, right? But you don't really think that you have to teach them anything about being Jewish, because whatever they need to know, they probably learn from their mothers. And that is what becomes known as domestic Judaism, okay? But the age of domesticity is not the 18th century, it's the 19th century, so we'll get there a little bit later. So there were these couple of dozen women, some of whom become rather famous, who have salons in their homes, and these very prominent Christian men, but Jewish men too, but mainly Christians. I mean, it was a very mixed society, it was an open society. And at first it was, said it was sort of, it was mixed, but it was really sort of a neutral society. I mean, Moses Mendelson had his own salon in philosophy, and his daughters had salons in literature, okay? His oldest daughter was named Dorothea. Well, originally her name was Brenda. Okay, so what you do is you get modern, you become modern, you learn German, you speak German, you change your name, and you become part of an elite circle of intellectuals, if you will. And so Grendel, or Dorothea, she was married to someone, I don't know if he was a doctor or a businessman, his name was Veit. And they had 2 sons, and she married very young. She married around the age of 18, which was, the wealthy girls married earlier than poor girls did. Poor girls had to raise enough money for a dowry. We talked about that before, okay? Well, wealthy girls, they could be married off pretty young and marrying someone who got a lot of money, and therefore, and they have, the fathers would give them a dowry of some kind, but they don't really, they don't have to work for it. So Dorothea Mendelson becomes very much interested in culture, literature, and romanticism. So she eventually, she was married to this Jewish guy, and she divorces her husband. And I guess he originally retains custody of the sons, but the sons eventually convert to Christianity too, like their mother did, father did. But Dorothea marries a German intellectual, named Schlegel, Friedrich Schlegel. And many of these intellectual men, they're coming from the noble class. They're not necessarily the wealthy nobles, though. They're the nobles who have, sort of, they're poor nobles, all right? So in order for, so sometimes poor nobles at that time period decide that they would like to marry wealthy Jewish girls. Good financial decision, okay? That's only, however, if these women will convert to Christianity, which they do. So Dorothea marries Friedrich Schlegel, and she converts to Protestantism. He was a Protestant. But then, through the Romantic movement, he becomes a Catholic, and so does she. And women, when they convert to Christianity, at least this particular group of women, convert to Christianity because they believe in it. They have no Jewish background to speak of, and the culture around them is Christian, and they're really into Romanticism. Goes into all this sort of medieval culture, and I don't know how much you know about Romanticism, but it is a movement of going back into the past and finding sort of roots in sort of more mystical settings rather than, it's not rational. It's not, the Enlightenment is rational and philosophical. The Romantic movement is literary, cultural, music, and it is more not mainstream. It's so anyhow, Dorothea marries Schlegel, and they both become Catholics, and good Catholics. And she has and she continues to have a salon in her home, even after she's no longer married to this wealthy Jewish man. Okay, she's not the only one. There was a woman by the name of Henrietta Hertz, who, I guess I should brought you some pictures. Henrietta Hertz, her father was a physician, and she is very cultured and educated, and she eventually converts to Protestantism. I'm not sure she ever gets married though, but she is as a salon woman. She has a salon in her home. Oh, wait a minute, she marries the Lemos, so she was married, and then she divorces, but she doesn't remarry. She doesn't intermarry. Okay, she converts. Okay, but these are very smart women who are very self-educated. They have not gone to school. They have certainly not gone to university. But they have been tutored at home, and they've learned all these things, and they've read all this stuff. And so you have these women who have these sort of open houses, certain days of the week in their homes, and all of the leading intellectual figures flock there, both Jewish and non-Jewish. And it looks like the wave of the future, that everybody's going to be converting, and not everybody wealthy and educated is going to be converting. And they're going to become part of this elite that's no longer Jewish. Now, becoming no longer Jewish was difficult because it's really hard in Germany, especially by the 19th century, for Jews to convert and to be accepted. They try harder, but they don't always make it. A third woman who's often discussed in considerable length is a woman by Rachelle Farnham von Ense. Name used to be Rachel Levin.
That's much easier.
Well, she married a nobleman.
So she had to have a bond.
Of course, well, she inherited that she came along with the husband. And she hadn't been married before that, actually. She was older when she married, I think in her 30s, 40s. But she had, she left a memoir about her experiences. And at the end of her life, she came to regret having converted, because she was never fully accepted as a German. But she was, her brother, I think, converts too. So it's not just women who convert, but in this case, and the Hannah Arendt, when she was still living in Germany, wrote a book about Rachelle Farnham, which is still available actually, and she was fascinated by someone who was that assimilated or acculturated that she actually becomes Christian. And but she never forgets that she's Jewish. I mean, but no matter how hard she tries,
They don't let her forget.
they don't let her forget him. Her husband was always very nice to her, and he was much younger. And it was a good marriage, and that was fine. But throughout her life, she just is never really accepted for the German that she wanted to be, because she was Jewish. And that's going to be the story of many German Jews, more so or less so. But this wave of conversions really just is a phenomenon of the late 18th century, and it's especially true in Berlin. It's not that the numbers of people who convert is that significant, it's who they are, okay? They are part of the elite, the wealthy elite, the courtier class, the educated class, and it looked as if that was the wave of the future. It wasn't, as it turned out, because they weren't accepted. But they still thought that in the 19th century, they thought that the way into Christian society was through conversion, like Heinrich Heine, who converts in the 1820s, 30s, and Ludwig Bernard, a friend of his, also converts in the 1820s, 30s, and they thought it was the admission ticket into the Christian world.
Well, what types of things happened to them that, I mean, clearly they still stayed Christian, but what sorts of things might have happened to them that they, did they see this frequently? Did things disturb them when they saw it?
It's not what they saw so much as
Or how they were treated, I guess.
how they were treated. They are not accepted. They thought that they could, number of the men in the 19th century, they studied law because they wanted to be lawyers or judges or what have you. But you really couldn't get a job, a government job, if you were Jewish. So you converted to get a job. Well, you might get the job, but you're not going to be accepted. You're just sort of semi-ostracized because there's a label that's still attached to you. And especially when there's a rise of anti-Semitism in the 19th century that keeps going up, especially in the 80s and 90s, the end of the century, you're just not part of the elite circle. And turns out that in many cases, many of their friends were other baptized Jews. This is also true of the women. In the 19th century, the women, not these Salon women, but some women do convert to intermarry, but generally they are going to be still in circles like themselves. Okay, it's sort of like intermarried families, Jewish and Christian marriages today, sometimes gather together and they're friends with each other because they understand each other. Now, nowadays, some of the women, it used to be that more of the women, actually more women than men, converted to Judaism. In Germany, you don't convert to Judaism very often. Some people convert back, but you don't, it's not the thing to do. Especially in the 1930s, I know somebody who tried to do it, but at any rate, you don't. Yes.
Can I just say, a couple years ago here, we read a book, it was historical fiction by Janet Belfer and After the Fire. And it's about the Salon Women
Mhm.
in Berlin. And it's
Yeah.
really fascinating. book.
That's the same woman.
And also, there's a book that I read it's a straight history book called The Pity of It All. It starts with Mendelson. With
Oh,
Felix
the pity of
Mendelson,
all,
or
is
with-
that, who wrote that?
I can't remember.
It's a male historian.
Yeah, but it starts with Moses Mendelson
Yes.
and it about the rise of, in the Enlightenment and everything, and how he kind of started it.
Well, he was
And
part
then-
of it.
And then,
Yeah, but the interesting thing about Moses Mendelssohn was that he remains Jewish.
yeah,
He remains an Orthoprax Jew, okay? He was part of the Enlightenment, but there was so much pressure on him by Christians. How could he be such a nice guy and not convert? I mean, how can you, be a part of the philosophical world and not believe in Christianity? Well, he didn't. And he wrote a book called Jerusalem, which explains why he doesn't convert. And I remember studying it in first year of graduate school, and he wanted change within the Jewish community. For example, he was in favor of the Christians used to complain that Jews bury their dead too quickly. How do you know they're really dead? So, because Christians, they're wakes, they're Catholic, and they're just a long process before they actually get buried, and because they can do that because they embalm. So it's a good reason for burying your dead sooner rather than later if you're not planning on embalming them. Yeah, I mean, it just gets. I mean, today
Hygienic reasons.
that you can freeze them, but you couldn't do that before. Well, they didn't have refrigerators in those days either.
No.
It couldn't, it was, but, and anyway, he did want some changes in the Jewish community, but he was still, he was still practicing Judaism. And many of these other people no longer did. And who are his followers, some convert, some don't, and this is what eventually will lead to the Reform movement in Germany. These people want to remain Jewish, but be accepted in the German world. And they have been impacted by German culture and German education, and they think that, essentially Reform Judaism is based on ethical culture, ethical monotheism. That's Judaism, so that's what they do. And so they want to keep the ethics. They like the prophets a lot, okay? Not quite as happy with Jewish law. 10 Commandments, fine, but why do you need the other 603? But they're doing this so that they can be German. They're still trying to get citizenship in Germany. They don't become citizens fully until 1870. Sometimes they become citizens a little bit earlier, depends on where you're living. But but full equality for German Jews comes about in 1870, and it really doesn't fully take place until the interwar years, when they're going to get kicked out of the German society completely. But it's, they go through different stages. But that's how, the Reform movement is a men's movement. There are no women in the German Reform movement. They're rabbis. They're university-educated rabbis, all male. And you have the development of not only Reform movement, but you have what's called the origins of what becomes American conservatism, but it's the creation of, you have 3 seminaries eventually created in Germany, modern seminaries, one of which is a Reform synagogue. It's the Ehrenstelt, I guess. Yeah. And the other is the Jewish Theological Seminary in Breslau, that's modeled for JTS. And the third is an Orthodox seminary, but it's also to train modern rabbis. And so even the Orthodox in Germany are impacted by the changes in the 19th century of becoming more German. Someone like Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was the leading modern Orthodox figure in the 19th century, he talked about Torah in Derech Eretz. We want to keep halakhic Judaism, but refine it in some way so that it is more, I don't know, dignified. It's the Reform movement that introduces, they don't introduce mixed seating in Germany. There is no mixed seating in Germany, ever. But they do introduce, women in choirs, and they introduce German sermons, and they introduce changing the liturgy, getting rid of the prayers to return to Zion. We don't believe in that anymore, so why do we have that in our prayer book? There's a series of, in the 19th century, a series of rabbinical conferences which keep on going a little bit farther in changing Jewish ritual so that it doesn't have so much ritual. And they like the ethics of it, and they think that everybody should become ethical monotheists, and they really generally do not accept Christianity for ideological reasons. They just don't believe in Jesus. It's that simple. And some of them become Christians even though they don't believe in Jesus, because they just want to be accepted in society. But most Jews wanted to stay Jewish, and it became, by the end of the 19th century and the 20th century, many highly assimilated German Jews do not convert to Christianity because they think that's a cop-out.
Mm-hmm.
They think that you were just not the proper thing to do.
So things kind of turn from people feeling they have to convert to be accepted to, hey, we're still participating in society more, but they don't necessarily need to convert.
Right. There was a way of conversion because they thought there was no other way. Okay. And then the Reform movement enabled them to some degree to stay within a Jewish community and not have and having services becoming more dignified. Because Christians apparently used to come to Jewish services in the early 19th century, and it wasn't very dignified. These services were all men, at least downstairs, and there were these kids running around, and there was these men talking, and they beat bushes on Sukkot, and they have these lulavim, they shake around, and it's just not very dignified. And they were very used to, they were Protestants. Most of them, okay? Reform movement is based on Protestantism. So German Jews were supposed to become more like their German neighbors who were Protestants, not the Catholic neighbors. Jews don't tend to emulate Catholics as much as they emulate Protestants. Now, there was no Reform movement in France, at least in the 19th century. There is now, but there wasn't before. But they had to, but then French Jews who want to become proper, make church services more like cathedral-like. Have you ever gone to the main synagogue in France? I can't remember what's the name of it. It's a very, very formal, fancy synagogue that, is sort of reminds you of a sort of a Gothic cathedral. Well, what really reminds you of the Gothic Cathedral is Temple Emmanuel in New York, but that is Reform. But you're influenced by who your neighbors are, and that's how you change your Judaism, based on who your neighbors are and who you want to be like.
Were the German Reform, were they into kashrut, or did they
No,
take away those?
gone.
Because they wanted to fit in with their neighbors.
They want to be like their neighbors. They only wanted to retain ethical principles, okay? The 10 Commandments, the basics. Yeah, you need those, don't kill. But and it used to be in Reform synagogues, Germany and the United States, that they used to stand up and recite the 10 Commandments as part of their service. Yeah, they really did. And, well, when Eastern European Jews started to come over and started to become Reform, they said, what? I mean, it's one thing if you're gonna stand up and recite 613, but why do you just choose 10? I mean, yes, they're the top 10, but, hooray. But, but it's, they wanted to be accepted as German citizens. Some felt they had to become German. They often regretted it. Someone like Heinrich Heine never stopped really being Jewish, but he was miserable. He lived in France much of his life, in Paris. And so so women were not part of the Reform movement per se, but they do undergo processes of emulating. I mean, there are Reform Judaism becomes the main right in Germany by about 1870. Okay, that's sort of the end of the rabbinical conferences there, beginning of the American rabbinical conference, but they never go anywhere near as far as American Reform goes. But they have introduced reforms and they've gotten rid of, kashrut, and they've gotten rid of, the things that people weren't doing anyway, because it was easier not to if you wanted to be like your neighbors. And so the women actually, and the men, of course, are now working on Saturdays. They're not observing Shabbat like the way they did in Eastern Europe or the way they did in Germany in the 18th up to the 18th century. You can't take Saturday off. It's a work day. These men are businessmen. Most of these men are in commerce. Okay. And they work on Saturdays. And so their wives are the ones who are going to come to synagogue.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the reasons that's at least used in this country for the reasons why women came down from the balcony in the 19th century in American Reform was so that the rabbi had somebody to look at on Saturday mornings at his level. I mean, men stopped doing these things. So, and this book here, which is fascinated by Benjamin Maria Bader, is interesting traditional picture on the cover with a Sabbath lamp at the top. It's in Germany, at least in the Reform movement, it's not women becoming more like men. In other words, they don't really study Judaic, women don't become yeshiva bochers. Men don't become yeshiva bochers either, and they become more like women. Okay. Remember how in Eastern Europe, Yiddish literature was written primarily for women or men who were like women? You don't have Yiddish literature in Germany, you don't. I mean, even though they used to speak it, or Judeo-German at least, which is Western Yiddish. But you have the women are now going to synagogue, there are German sermons, and and a lot of the service is now in German. Why? Because the women never know Hebrew, and the men don't understand Hebrew anymore either. Besides if they were there. But they become 3-day-a-year Jews. They still go to shul, they still fast on Yom Kippur, although even that starts to slide eventually among many families. First the men say, I can fast better on a full stomach, so they eat breakfast. And women sometimes get into that too. But women preserve the culture in the home. They are the ones who preserve Judaism when their husbands are too busy to worry about such things. Okay? Their husbands are out in the workplace. You now have you don't have home offices anymore. You don't have, your house is your own, you don't manufacture things at home. The men go out in the world, the women stay home. And relatively small percentage of German Jewish women worked outside the home before World War I, maybe about less than 20%. And those were mainly, widows and women who were divorced women often help their husbands, as we've seen before. That doesn't always count as working, because they're not getting paid to do that. I have adopted that definition of work. My attitude was, when I don't get paid, I'm not working. So I don't work. But it's crazy, because I know it's not so, but this was true for the whole generation in the 19th century. They modernize, and they want to become emancipated. They want to have civil rights, and they feel that they have to earn it. They can't just, it isn't something that's going to be given them, they have to deserve it. And therefore the reform movement is to prove that Jews can be respectable citizens just like everybody else, exactly like everybody else, but different only in religion. And that's a modified religion. And so the men are less outwardly Jewish, they don't dress any differently than any other man. And the women don't dress differently than any other women either, but they are still preserving a more traditional lifestyle because they aren't in the workplace. Their friends are, they used to live, on a Jewish street, sometimes in a ghetto, sometimes not, but unless you lived in a small town and you were the only Jewish family there, you really didn't associate too much with non-Jewish women because your friends were all like you. And even in cities, they lived in certain neighborhoods, which sort of become gilded ghettos, I suppose, as we used to say in New York and stuff in the United States in the late 19th century, 20th century. So the women modernize, but they modernize together as a group, and what they do is in the home. Now, they might no longer have a traditional Friday night dinner. Their husbands aren't going to be there. I can remember when that happened in our family when my father started to work on Friday night dinner without my father, it's like, but the women, which, the family and ceremonies and seders and, lighting candles and blessing kids and what have you, if you can bless them, this becomes central to Jewish identity. The same thing that's happened in the American Jewish community. Whatever Judaism there is in the home. The problem is there isn't very much left in the home. So then it's up to the synagogue to provide. But the synagogue can't replace the home. If there isn't a home, there's no, it's not going to work. But it took us centuries to figure this out. So in Germany, you have the women who are primarily wives and mothers. This is the era of domesticity, the cult of domesticity. Women are now elevated. Okay, they're no longer looked down as second-class citizens. They're not citizens yet, but because they can't vote, but they are seen as put on a pedestal and idealized as pure and whatever, which is just as bad as when they're going the other way. And also these women are wealthy. These middle-class women were very comfortable. They had domestic servants in the home, most of whom were not Jewish by this point. But the women, but they would have family gatherings on holidays, on Sundays, if they didn't have them Friday night. Families would get together and stick together. And they would be very interrelated with other, often generations would live not far from each other, and the grandmother would be with the family for Shabbat, or move in with the family if she's a widow. And so this would be preserving the culture and the traditions in the home. So yes, women do go to synagogue, men don't, but the primary base of German Jewry is the bourgeois home. And but there's definitely It's definitely a division of labor. The men go out in the workplace and they work so hard, and they come home and the wives have to, calm them down, and, they put their feet up and read the newspaper, and, and their kids have to behave when daddy is home, and, German Jewish children, German children in general, they toe the line. So but you just have to help. Your husband has a hard life because he's in the workplace. Women, of course, don't. They're at home and they're doing all kinds of stuff. But now what they're also doing is going out and working, doing charitable organizations, creating women's organizations. In the late 19th century into the 20th century, you start to get all of these Jewish women's organizations. The Frauen Bund, which is the largest German Jewish organization, founded in 1903, 1904, sometime around in there. And this is sort of like their equivalent of Hadassah, okay, except it wasn't Zionist. But so women are doing charitable work, helping other women and children, helping the poor, doesn't have to be Jewish. But they're raising money, they're having benefits to raise money for whatever worthy cause they're raising on. Exactly the same thing happens here among German Jews. Same thing in the 19th century, into the 20th. They are, some people say, okay, well, they don't do very much, they're very frivolous, but they're not. Some of them are very serious. And by the end of the 19th century, they're involved in, the women don't get involved in the temperance movement. They're not, Jewish men didn't generally get drunk. Maybe they did, but they didn't get drunk as often as non-Jews did. But there was a great deal of Jewish prostitution. Often Jewish men, but then eventually Jewish women as the prostitutes. And especially migrants going to England or coming to the United States. So Jewish women's organizations who would never have talked about prostitution before. You didn't talk about such things. They realized they had a problem. So they had to save other Jewish women and, provide them with housing, help them raise their kids, because they all generally had kids. And you had to protect them. So that's one of the major things that the Frauenbund did. And when it's like the National Council of Jewish Women, when immigrants came to the United States, came to New York, as soon as they got off the ship, there were women there to try to make sure that they were not caught by a white slaver. And it was a Jewish problem. And it explodes in Latin America. And at one time, the pimps, I guess you could call them. Anyway, the men who owned brothels, they formed their own class in Argentina, Buenos Aires. These were European women, many of whom were Jewish, not all perhaps, but the men make a good living through prostitution, and they had their own organizations because they could no longer belong to the Jewish men's organization, so they had their own. That's okay, So this all starts in Eastern Europe, and when there's a migration to the West in the late 19th century, it comes with them, and Jewish women do good, like Christian women, by trying to, save, not quite fallen women in the case of Jews, but help women who had no choice but to become prostitutes because there was no other way they could earn a living. And so that is one of the main issues of the Jüdische Frauenbund, which was founded by a woman named Bertha Pappenheim. Is that name familiar to you?
What was the organization?
The Jewish Women's Federation, the Jüdische Frauenbund.
No. But I thought a woman founded in the 19th century Hias.
No, not Hias. The women founded in the 20th century founded Youth Aliyah and all, that sort of thing, but not HIAS, no, I think it's always been a men's organization. But Bertha Poppenheim, she was Freud's Anna O.
Oh, okay.
And she, wealthy Jewish family, she got kind of hysterical, and they put her into therapy. And eventually, her therapist was Joseph Breuer. And when she gets out of therapy, she never married. And when she gets out of therapy, she becomes very, very involved in Jewish women's work. And she was the president of the Jewish Crown Board. And she was an Orthodox Jew. She remained an Orthodox Jew all her life. Vienna originally and lands up in Frankfurt and runs a home for unwed mothers. And she's really an outstanding Jewish woman. And many of the other women who were part of the Frauenbund were involved in similar charitable and rescue work, and they would go into the homes of the poor and tell people how they should live. Same problem in this country. The poor might not have, or poor Jews or poor non-Jews might not have appreciated it, but that's what they were doing. It was do-gooder work. Okay, any questions about any of that stuff?
The Bund, the word Bund is just organization, there's not a social.
Frauenbund, Bund means federation.
Okay,
Yeah, so it's viewed as your Frauenbund, it's the women's.
so it's only later that it took the socialist.
That's Germany in the early 20th, I'm sorry, Eastern Europe in the early 20th. It was founded in 1897, actually, in Eastern Europe. And that was the Federation of Jewish Workers of Poland and Lithuania originally. And the word Bund is still used.
Yeah.
But there was the German-American Bund too.
Yeah.
That was anti-Semitic. So any federation could be.
There are still places here in Bucks County
I'm sure.
that were former Bunds, and they're now called swim clubs
Or
soccer clubs.
Well, they might be swim clubs, and
But they don't advertise, they're there. And if you say, what kind of, if you call them on the phone, what kind of organization, so
we're swim club.
we're a swim club. And, how do I join?
Well, you don't.
You don't.
It's a men's organization.
It's a very involved application.
But the same thing is true for country clubs.
Yeah.
And non-Jewish country clubs excluded Jews, and German Jewish country clubs excluded Eastern European Jews. It's not just upper class Christians who discriminate against Jews. Upper class Jews discriminated against Jews too. They also help them.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that next semester.
Well, told them how to live, help them.
Well, no, I mean, they do help.
Yeah.
They really do. They provide facilities for them on the Lower East Side. They create, it's German Jews who create the Jewish Theological Seminary, and they pay for it to try to Americanize Eastern European Jews. That's what it was all about. Otherwise, why pay for it? I mean, let them pay for it, but the Jews pay for it on the Lower East Side. Okay, I think that, I guess there's a class in here.
Yes. I won't be here next week.
You won't
So
be?
this is, I'll be in Las Vegas celebrating Hanukkah with my grandchildren.
Well, in